I will begin, and I will begin our session. So once again, welcome. It's really good to see everybody here. I'm not going to recapitulate what we did last week with only 4 sessions. If I start recapitulating, we'll end up with only effectively 1 session. So I'm just going to presume what we did last week. But I am going to begin, as I like to always begin, by carefully setting our motivation, and to remember that we are operating within the broad context of the Mahayana tradition, and that the Mahayana tradition is defined not by a particular metaphysical view or epistemological view, but rather by an altruistic aspiration to attain awakening for the sake of sentient beings. That's bodhicitta. And so to remember that our purpose in doing this, however abstract the arguments may be, is to make ourselves better instruments for the welfare of others, and to approach all of this with that attitude in mind. I'm also going to remind you of the ground rules, and the main ground rule is interrupt me whenever you want, either by physically raising your hand, shouting, using the raise your hand icon, or whatever you want to do. But I don't want you to feel that you have to wait till the end for questions. We can always stop and address questions and undertake digressions and do whatever we need to do to make learning most effective. In the space between last time and this time, Sneha sent me 2 questions that arose that didn't get asked last time. And I'm going to give them a brief bit of attention before I turn to the text for tonight. The first question was how we define physical. And I'm not going to read the entire question, but the person seemed to suggest that there is no sense of physical at all. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I'm not in the business of defining physical, and neither are Yogācārans. As I pointed out, I think it's a mistake to think that we're operating here with some kind of idealistic tradition that is denying the existence of anything or asserting the special reality of anything else. Normally, from the standpoint of Buddhist metaphysics, we think of the rupa skandha as a physical skandha, as physical matter, the stuff that our bodies are made out of, the stuff that our sense organs are made out of. That doesn't involve any particular theory of physicality. And I really don't think it's going to help us to try to get into defining terms. That's just a kind of way out of thinking rather than a way in. The second question was this. He said the Yogācārans were practical meditators. They had drawn from actual experiences and not blah, 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 empty words. They'd figured it out. Well, some of them were and some of them weren't. There was a lot of philosophy being done. We're reading a lot of abstract thought, which might count as blah, 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 empty words to the person who's asking this question. As I said, I think the Yogācāra tradition is a very large tradition, and trying to say that this is what the tradition was about or that is what the tradition is about is largely a mistake. What we're doing tonight and the previous night and the next few nights is looking at some specific Yogācāran texts. And we're focusing on, I think, the only doctrines that I think are shared throughout the Yogācāra tradition. Those are the doctrines of the 3 natures and the 3 naturelessnesses, and of the Alaya Vijnana and its role in the arising of consciousness. So I'm not trying to worry about space. I'm not trying to worry about tactile sensations. And I'm not afraid of the expression chittamatra, mind only. I just don't think there's any reason to believe that the words mind only mean that the only thing that there is a mind. I think that we can offer many more expansive readings of that meaning, of that term. And I would really like to try to set aside the big debates about idealism that motivate both of these questions. I don't think they help us at all. I think we're better when we think about Yogācāra as a phenomenology and try to understand what it says about the subjective side of emptiness. So that's a brief response to those questions. A long response would probably take up most of the session and would do exactly what I don't want to do, namely to engage with the idealism issue. So having said that, which I hope doesn't sound too dismissive, but I really do think that it takes us in the wrong direction, I now want to take us into the text. And the text that I wish to discuss with you tonight is chapter 6 of the Saṃdhinirmocana-sūtra, the questions of Yogācāra. This is a beautiful section because it gets us into the three natures. Next time we will read chapter 7, which are the questions of Paramartha-samagata, and those are the three naturelessnesses. So the way the sutra is organized in this section is to take us first through the three natures, then through the three naturelessnesses. And I think that if we can go deep and carefully through this text, it will give us a really good understanding of what the sutra is up to and what Yogācāra thought is up to. Okay, so Yogācāra asks this really nice question. Of course, every chapter of this sutra begins with a question asked by a different bodhisattva. He says, "Hey Buddha, when you say that bodhisattvas are wise with respect to the character of phenomena, the characteristic of things, how are they wise? Why do you say that they're wise with respect to characteristics?" And you can see why Yogācāra might be asking this question and what the question is setting up. It's not a random question and it's not posed in a random way. Because in a lot of Madhyamaka texts and Madhyamaka sutras, so think about the Vajracharaka or the Diamond Cutter Sutra for a minute, we have pounded into us again and again that things don't have any characteristics, right? That things don't have any character. Think about the opening homage verses for Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karaka. Without arising, without ceasing, without coming, without going, without permanence, without impermanence, right? All of these, we get told these things have no character. And so Yogācāra is saying, hey, Buddha, yeah, you might have said that sometimes, but now you're saying that they do have characters. What are you talking about? That's what's motivating this, is how we can understand a positive sense of what a bodhisattva's wisdom grasps. So the Buddha says in response, he says, hey, Yogācāra, there's three characteristics of things, right? Yeah, I might have said things don't have any characteristics, but there's a different sense now. We're on to a different teaching, a teaching about how things appear to us. And things have three characteristics. And I'm not going to always use John's translation here because I think some of it's a little bit ugly, though I don't think any of it's wrong. The imagined nature, the dependent nature, and the consummate nature. So where John is translating imputational character, or for Parikalpita Svabhava, I'm saying imagined nature, the nature we imagine things to have. Where John is translating Paratantra Svabhava as other dependent nature, I'm just using dependent nature. And where he's translating Parinishpana as thoroughly established character, I'm translating it as consummate nature. Now, I want to talk a little bit about those terms with you, because I think the words are important, and I want to take us through a little bit of the underlying Sanskrit, so that whatever we use in English, whether you like John's language or you like my language, we're thinking our way through to the Sanskrit. The first thing to notice, and I think this is really, really important, is that the first and the third natures are described with a different part of speech than the second nature. So parikalpita, the imagined nature, parinishpana, the consummate nature, versus paratantra, the dependent nature. Paratantra is a nominal construction. So it's talking about something that exists, that is. The dependent nature is just taken for granted as a nature of things. But parikalpita and parinishpana are each past participles. Something's been done to them. Imagined, we've done the imagining here. or consummate. We have somehow consummated it or thoroughly understood it. So each of those is on the side of the mind, talking about how we understand those, whereas Paratantra is really just talking about the object. And it's easy to miss that grammatical distinction when we look at the English, but I want you to be reading through the English to see that. So there's something special about that middle nature, the Paratantra. It is describing, in a way, something that we haven't done, but something that's kind of the raw material there. Whereas Parikalpita is one thing we can do to it. We can parakalpify it, or imagine it, or impute characteristics to it. Or we can parinishpafy it. That is, we can purify it of that imputation and come to completely understand it. So that's important to bear in mind as we talk about these three natures, that they're not all of the same kind. So any questions about that before we go on? It sounds fussy, but it gets important later on. Okay, then I continue. So the Buddha then says, "Hey, Yogācāra, what is the imagined nature of phenomena?" Now I want to stop right there with what does that question even mean? When he says, what is the imagined nature? Remember, again, that imagined here is, just as it is in this English translation, a past participle. So way of asking this question is, how do we imagine things to be? How do we ordinarily imagine the objects of our experience? He says, it's that which is imagined as in terms of a name or a symbol, or some way of talking about the attributes of phenomena in order to designate anything whatsoever. So what does this mean? It means that when we imagine things, we imagine them as having the characteristics that we apprehend in them, as existing in the way that we actually perceive them. This is what I like to map this really tightly onto what the 20th century German philosopher Husserl called the natural attitude towards things. Whenever you look at anything around you, you look at it and you just see it and take it to exist just as you see it. When you taste something, you take it to taste just as it appears on your tongue. And when you hear a sound, you take it to sound just as you hear it. And you take that visual characteristic or that auditory characteristic or that gustatory characteristic to be there in the object before you apprehended it. And you take your own sense organs just to be apprehending something that's absolutely there, that's all previously there. So, to get really boring about it, if I pick up a red apple on my desk and I hold it and smell it and then bite into it, I ordinarily, pre-reflectively, automatically think that the apple was red all along, and my eyes just accurately registered the color that's in the apple, that the apple smelled sweet all along, and my nose just apprehended that odor, that the apple was smooth all along, and my fingers just apprehended that texture, and that the apple was sweet and juicy all along, and my mouth just apprehended that characteristic. Now, that is our reflex way of doing that. We imagine the apple to have those characteristics in it. But if we reflect, we recognize that that's got to be wrong. Because when we imagine how other animals or other beings might apprehend the apple, they might apprehend it in very, very different ways. Birds seeing in the ultraviolet and the infrared might see very different colors. My dog might apprehend a much more delicate bouquet of aromas in the apple. Another organism might taste it and find that it tastes very acidic and so forth. There's only the way the apple shows up for me. But the question here is, the answer here is, what is the imputational character? How do we imagine it? We imagine it to exist with the characteristics that we apprehend in it. And it takes a bit of reflection and thought to see that those characteristics are actually things that we project onto it in virtue of the way that it affects our sense organs. So that's a way that we imagine it. That's not the way that it is. That make sense? Okay. The second question, the second answer. The Buddha says, Yogācāra, what's the dependent nature of phenomena? What is that? Now remember, that's the one that's not a past participle. That's the one that's talking about the things themselves before we've done anything cognitive to them. And he says it's just dependent origination. When this exists, that arises. When this is produced, that's produced. It's just dependent origination. It's just the causal process. So when we come back to my apple and we ask, what's the dependent nature of the apple? The dependent nature of the apple is the fact that it arises in virtue of causes and conditions, or more specifically, not the apple, but my apprehension of the apple. We start talking about the psychophysics of the perception of the apple. The dependent nature of the apple visually is light reflecting off of something, being refracted in my eye, causing electrochemical stuff on my retina, sending neural impulses up through the visual system, and stuff happening in my occipital lobe. That's the dependent nature of my perception of the apple. That's what's actually happening. And notice that there's nothing shiny, red, or solid in that story. The dependent nature is just a perceptual process, a gustatory, an auditory, an olfactory, maybe an auditory perceptual process. We take that process and we then imagine that it's delivering the world to us just as it is, but all it's delivering is the output of that process. And then the final thing that the Buddha says in this initial interchange, he says, Yogācāra, what is the consummate nature of phenomena? What are they really like? What is it to really understand an object of experience? And it is the reality of phenomena. That word suchness is a word that I've always hated because I don't think it's really English. And I think that you ought to translate Sanskrit or Tibetan into English. And the word is tatata in Sanskrit. And tata means that, right? The way it is, the reality of the thing, what it is to be that thing. It's the reality of phenomena. Bodhisattvas cultivate a realization of that. It's what establishes all of the stages up to awakening. Now, so he hasn't told us what that is yet. He's going to tell us in a little while, and I'm going to give you a preview of coming attractions so that we can understand what this consummate nature is, because this is the one place where the sutra is a little bit promissory and vague. The official definition of the consummate nature is that it's the absence of the imagined in the dependent. Now that's a complicated and weird locution, but here's what it means. When we naively or naturally perceive things, we superimpose the imagined nature on the dependent. So I have a bunch of cognitive processes and I say, wow, that's my senses and mind perfectly reflecting the independent nature of an apple as red, shiny, smooth, sweet smelling, and crunchy. That is the presence of the imagined in the dependent. There it is, I've superimposed it. The consummate is the absence of the imagined in the dependent. It's removing that superimposition and just seeing the dependent as it is. Now notice what that means though. It's not quite as simple as it seems. First thing is, the consummate nature, it's something that we have to consummate, that we have to complete, that we have to come to understand. So it's the effect of hard work stripping off the natural attitude or the spontaneous attitude of taking the phenomena that we experience to exist as we experience them. Let's recall for a minute. This is something we talked about last week, and I want to recall it in order to be able to use it this week. We talked about the definition of illusion and why Yogācāra is really about how it is that we come to create the illusion of a dualistically existing substantial world. The definition of an illusion is something that exists in one way, but appears in another. So we say that a mirage is an illusion because it exists as a refraction pattern, but appears to be water. We can say that an echo is an illusion because it exists as a sound bouncing off a wall, but it sounds like a sound originating someplace else, and so forth. All of the examples of illusion are like that. Each one is an example of something whose mode of existence and mode of appearance are discordant. Now, when we think about the imagined nature, which is describing our everyday conventional experience of the world, what this text wants you to see at this point is that that is massive, massive illusion and nothing else. Because the way that our minds work, whenever we apprehend any object at all, and that includes not only external objects like apples, but internal objects like emotions or thoughts or memories or perceptions. Whenever we apprehend anything, all we have is that thing as it appears, subject to the kinds of sense faculties and cognitive faculties that we have. All we know is how our senses deliver that to us. But we experience it as though we're seeing the very reality of the thing itself. Now, that is an illusion. And that really is, on the Yogācāra analysis, the fundamental illusion that generates samsara, that we're confusing our experience with things experienced. And in fact, we're confusing our experience with things experienced just as they are through flawless, transparent sensory and cognitive faculties. Now, the trick then is to dispel that illusion. So when we've got a consummate, a complete understanding of things, then it's not that things disappear. It's that we now experience them as the superimposition that they are. And so we find ourselves apprehending a causal process that we experience in a particular way. So this is really deep and complicated work to be done. This is trying to step out of the natural attitude, to step out of our cognitive reflexes and come instead to attend to our experience as it is without projecting that experience as an independently existing world. Try that. It's really hard. And that's why this kind of doctrine requires a lot of meditative practice in order to leverage yourself into that kind of perception. So that's the first pass on the three natures. The first nature is simply the way the interdependent series of causes and conditions in perception shows up for us. The second nature is that very causal pattern. And the third is that causal pattern stripped of the superimposition of the imagined. And so notice that the third one is a negation, just as emptiness is a negation in the Madhyamaka. The first one is positive. The second one you might think of as neutral with respect to this. And the third is a negation of superimposition. In Buddhism, you learn quickly that everything that's positive is negative. That is, anything that's got positive value is a negation. And anything that's got negative value is something positive, a superimposition. And so you always want to try to remember that. Questions so far? This is hard stuff, and we're jumping right into the deep end now.
Yeah, I guess what the difficulty of recognizing that third aspect, I'm thinking, even from a scientific perspective, is you always have some perceptual process of knowing or epistemological process of knowing. And so to establish any ontological validity is in itself an assumption that there is something there that is beyond our knowing process.
I'm going to accept the first half and not the second for a minute, at least as an example,
Yeah.
at least as an exposition. So let me explain what I mean by that. The first half is very insightful. That is, it's really hard to do this because what your temptation is to say, oh, it's not this, it's this. It's not a red apple, it's just a causal process. And that causal process is then reified as an object that I then take myself to be experiencing. And what that means is that as long as I've got objectifying experience, as long as I've got any subject-object duality, as long as I've got any object that I'm thinking about, there's going to be a gulf between the way that object exists and the way I experience it, and a superimposition through cognitive reflex that that object exists as I experience it, because that's our reflex. So the trick is, that's the first part, and that's where we agree. And that's why this is not trivial, and it is not superficial. It's a very, very deep and very difficult point. But the promise that Yogācāra is offering is that it is possible for us to come to be aware of the fact that the characteristics we're experiencing are our cognitive superimpositions, and to stop endorsing those as a window into reality, as it were, to take responsibility for our contribution to the experience, and not to think that it's coming from the side of the object as it is. That doesn't mean that we ought to replace it with something else. That's where we differ here. And that's where the Yogācāra idea that the consummate is a mere negation. It's not to replace it with a different way of experiencing the other dependent as an object. It's to replace it with non-objectifying, non-dual experience. Let me try to give you a preliminary analogy to that, just to see if it works for now. I often like to compare the phenomenological goal of Yogācāra practice to what often gets called in contemporary psychology, especially sports psychology, flow states. Because if you've ever been in a really good flow state, and footnote, we could actually talk about Buddha nature and primordial awakening in terms of omnipresent flow states, but I don't want to go there quite yet, maybe in the fourth session. But if we think in an ordinary sense, if you've ever been playing a sport or a musical instrument, or just lost in conversation or thought, and suddenly you recognize that you aren't aware of your surrounding as objects and yourself as subject, that you're just engaging without that kind of dualistic objectifying experience that, is characteristic of a lot of expert performance. That might be roughly what we're talking about when we talk about the other dependent stripped of the imagined. That we're not saying, oh, this has this characteristic, this has this characteristic. We're not labeling things and explicitly objectifying them, just spontaneously engaging with them. And you can see the goal of Yogācāra practice in one way as global flow, to engage with the world entirely without the explicit objectification of things, and say, okay, now I've seen this thing as it is, it's red, and so forth. And that might help a little bit. Because the thing about a flow state is we don't replace one form of explicit thetic object awareness with another. We go back to a pre-thetic awareness, and awareness that doesn't involve conceptualization, labeling, objectification, and duality.
It seems to me like a distinction between knowing of anything and simply being in a non-dual
maybe
being mind without object.
Yes, or no, I would say without mind as well. And we'll see.
Being mind without object.
Yeah. One way to think about that, the way I like to think about it, a term that we often see in Buddhist thought is this term avatara, right? Like in Madhyamaka avatara, Bodhicharya avatara, which means engagement, engaging.
Yeah.
And when something's engaged, it's not standing aside from something else looking at it. It's totally enmeshed with it and one with it. And so I think of this as the difference between seeing the world and being engaged in the world. When we see the world, we see ourselves as subject and the world as object. And by doing that, we abstract ourselves and remove ourselves from the world. But when we're engaged in the world, if we're playing a sport or playing an instrument or really attending to somebody, we don't have that subject and object sensibility. Here I am as the mind seeing it. Here's the thing that I'm seeing. We just have spontaneous engagement. And so I like to think of Yogācāra as a way of taking us from perception to engagement. But that's just a different set of metaphors. And I think maybe right now what we're doing is casting about for metaphors, and it's probably useful to cast about for them, but to recognize that the metaphors will only take us partway there. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So now I want to go to some of the metaphors that the text is going to bring us, because this text, you can tell that the text is having trouble because it moves to metaphors right away. It doesn't give us analysis. It says you can see it like this.
Professor, there are a couple of hands up. Did you want to take questions now?
Oh, sure. I can't see them from where I
Yeah,
am.
sorry. Okay. I think Nick Ivy. Nick, do you want to unmute? Abelardo? Oh, there's Nick. Okay.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. Professor, so of course, sounds to me like what you're saying is the way things appear is just naturally conflated, their inherent existence with reality. So when we go to do analysis on the absence of the way we think of things, let's say, that's part of the reason why there's a danger of falling into nihilism, because you kind of negate way too far because you're still conflating inherent qualities with reality.
Yep.
But I had another question, and I think it's related to what you're saying about the perception and maybe the conversation last time about the I don't know if that would be topic out of Garba or not for like Japan and China, talking about the sentience in things.
Yeah, I don't want to go there tonight.
Okay, can I rephrase my question? Okay, so so we're seeing things, but because it seems to me that the mind is not located in the body, there's a sense in which the mind it's not exactly pervasive across the things that we're experiencing, but it's also not that way. Is that on the right track?
No, I would stop trying to worry about the relationship between mind and body or mind and objects. At this point, what the text is trying to do is to try to explore what we might call the phenomenology of perception and why it is that we end up with a massively illusory experience of the world. And it's doing that in terms of these three natures: an imagined nature, a dependent nature, and a consummate nature. Notice that nothing here is talked about the mind, or the mind and the body, or the mind and the world. It's about the three natures of the object of experience and how that figures in our awareness. I would stay focused on that. Eventually, we might come to the questions that you're asking, but stay focused on this. We're going to really work through the Yogācāra chapter because we want to get really clear about the three nature theory. Why do we want to do that? Because next time we're going to be hitting the three naturelessness theory, and we need the three natures to explain the three naturelessnesses. And they give us the final account of emptiness. And that final account of emptiness allows us to explain how an empty world is understood to be not empty, why that's an illusion, and where it comes from. So I'm going to say, keep your eyes on the prize. And the prize is page 83 right now.
Okay. So we have one more question from Abelardo.
Yep.
Yes, my question is, if this first nature, the imagined nature, I don't see so clearly the difference between the Madhyamika statements that all perceptions can be valid or non-valid, mistaken or non-mistaken, but they are always deceptive because
Yeah.
yeah. So is there any difference there?
There's not an inconsistency, but there is a difference. When we talk about deceptiveness in Madhyamaka, the deceptiveness in conventional phenomena is that they exist interdependently or as empty, but appear to exist independently, to exist intrinsically. So the deception there is things that are empty of intrinsic existence appearing to exist intrinsically. The deceptiveness we're pointing to here is a related but different deceptiveness. This is the deceptiveness that goes like this. The attributes that we assign to things, the things that we see are deceptive because they appear to have the attributes we perceive in them, whereas in fact, those attributes are simply imagined by us as a result of perceptual and cognitive processes. So one is the Madhyamaka are worrying about the metaphysical question of intrinsic existence versus emptiness. The Yogācāra are worried about the phenomenological question of where did that red come from? Where did that sweetness come from? Is it something in the object that I detected, or is it something that I've constructed? And it's arguing that I'm confusing something I've constructed with something I've detected. So it's a different illusion or a different analysis of illusion. And it's an analysis that's more on the phenomenological than on the metaphysical side. Now notice that these are not inconsistent. We can say both of them are present. Yes, apples appear to exist intrinsically when in fact they're empty. But guess what? They also appear to be red when in fact the only redness is a redness that I've constructed, not a redness in the apple. They appear to be sweet and crunchy, where the sweet and crunchiness is something that I've constructed, not something in the apple. That's a different analysis.
Yes, but I've also read that in the Madhyamaka they talk about the object generality that one also superimposes on a given phenomenon one is perceiving. So that would be the other kind that you were explaining, not just the metaphysical aspects. Am I correct or incorrect?
When you start talking about the superimposition of universals on particulars, notice that that's coming not from Madhyamaka, that's coming from the Pramanavada tradition. And the Pramanavada tradition arises within the Yogācāra tradition. So what you're doing is you're taking, I think, is you're looking at a Geluk Tibetan fusion, as it were, of ideas from the Pramana tradition with Madhyamaka.
Yeah, I read this in Tashi Sarin's book. Now, on Buddhist psychology.
Yeah. So what you're doing now is you're drawing, and this is nothing wrong with this. It's in the critique. I'm just pointing out that the ideas that you're talking about now are in fact ideas that come from the Yogācāra, not the Madhyamaka tradition.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. In Tibet, these ideas begin to get combined in very creative ways, and that's not a problem. That's just a historical fact of synthesis of these ideas. But those ideas themselves are coming from Dignaga and Dharmakirti, who are in the Yogācāra tradition.
Okay.
Cool.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of fun the way this works.
Can I ask you a question on the dependent nature to go back to that?
Of course.
So I follow, the perceptual process, and then the naming of it as red, sweet, and all is the imagined nature.
Yep.
But when a thought comes up in my mind, and like I say, I'm feeling angry or I'm feeling irritable, like even that is something arising and then I'm naming it.
Yep.
And that's also part of the imagined nature.
Yes. And that's really cool. So let me spend time with how cool that is, okay? This is a really deep attack, and it's sometimes people don't see this, and this is part of why I want to say it's really not idealism, right? Because idealism is going to give us a kind of immediate access to our mind. Yogācāra wants to really deny that we have immediate access to anything that shows up in experience. It's always mediated. It's always mediated by our own inner sensory capacities. And that mediation, whenever it's mediated that way, what turns up as a result of that mediation is something that presents itself as immediate. So just as when I see the apple, and I know reflectively that it's mediated by my eyes and my visual faculty, it shows up as an apple that I'm seeing directly, right? That's the deceptiveness. Now, if I look inside and say, I've got a headache, or I'm really happy these days, that's showing up in my introspective sense. And my introspective sense is delivering my inner states to me in just as mediated a way as my visual faculty is delivering visible objects to me. So what I now know is the way my inner state appears to me in introspection, and it shows up as though that's just the way it is, and introspection discovered it. But in fact, I constructed it in the introspective process. And if I were to ask the question, well, what would that state look like if I introspected it differently? Then, and which introspective technique would have been right? Things fall apart. Notice, again, I said this last week, this is a gigantic scoop of Freud. So when you talk to your analyst, I'm not recommending that anybody get an analyst right now, but if I was talking to my analyst, I'm not saying that I've got one, and I sort of talk about what's going on in my mind, my analyst isn't going to think that I'm right about all of that. He's going to think that what he's getting is the way that I introspect what's going on in my mind. And that's what the Yogācārans thought, that the best we can get is the way that something appears to us, not the way that it is. Because the only way we can ever become conscious of it is through faculties that can only deliver an appearance. So this is a gigantic attack on the very idea of immediacy.
Can I
That's
get
very
back?
profound.
Can I return to the metaphor of the expert or the flow state?
Yeah.
And because the thought has occurred to me that I think, if I understand the flow state properly, it's characterized by the absence of self.
Yeah.
And that it is kind of the closest thing we get to a state of pure being. And if I think about the metaphor of the football player, the tight end going out for a pass, and
Yeah.
or a musician in a drum circle or whatever, is the moment that self appears, then the rhythm's lost. The moment that self appears, you miss the ball. So that state of being is the closest thing that we can be to being in sync with the third way of
That's right.
Okay, you get what I'm saying, yeah.
It's when we're at our best. It's when we're most effective, right? Now, notice there's a cute tie here. We began by setting our motivation. And our motivation was bodhicitta, to become the most effective agents we can be for the benefit of sentient beings. Now, just as an athlete is at her most effective when she's in flow, and a musician is playing his best when he's in flow, a bodhisattva is most effective when they are in perfect flow. And in this case, flow is the same kind of constant perceptual, constant engagement with the world, rather than distanced subject-object objectifying perception of the world. So these things are very much connected. My teacher always likes to remind students, every syllable of Buddha Dharma is about ethics. So here, where we're talking abstractly about these three natures, and you might wonder, what does that have to do with ethics? This is what it has to do with ethics. As long as you encounter other sentient beings, and you encounter them through the imagined nature, and you confuse the way they appear to you with what they are, you're going to be ineffective. Only when you actually have a flow-like, non-objectifying, non-dual engagement can you be a truly effective agent for the benefit of others. Sometimes in the counseling world, we call that being truly present. And that sounds ultra easy. And part of what we're discovering just on this first page of the Yogācāra chapter is it's really hard. Turns out perfection is harder than it sounds. Is this making sense?
Oh, yeah, and there, I understand why it's a negation as well, why it has to be a removal of the artifacts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we get a really cool metaphor that's going to help us. And now this, because of the conversation, this metaphor will be easier. So the Buddha says, hey, Yogācāra, here's an example. The imagined nature should be seen like and here John has done some weird stuff, like cataracts in the eyes of a person with cataracts. Okay, so you've got a fuzziness or cloudiness in your vision. So the imagined nature then is something added to it, right? Notice that's the important point. Cataracts don't take something away from our perception, they add fog to it. And so he says it's like that. And Yogācāra, the other dependent nature, is just like, now notice this, the appearance of the manifestations of those cataracts to the person. They might look like hairs or insects or seeds or a blue cloud or something like that, right? So notice what he's done. The imagined nature is the objects. The dependent nature is the appearance of the objects. When we take the objects to be there in our visual field, we've objectified them, and I say, oh, I see falling hairs, or I see little bugs in my visual field, or I see clouds in my visual field. Now, if we take those to be actual objects of perception, we're out of our minds, right? I mean, our ophthalmologist is going to tell us that. He's saying, no, what's happening is there are appearances in your visual field, but they're not objects. So that what the ophthalmologist is doing is saying, pay attention to the causal process here. You're not seeing objects. There's a causal process that's making it appear that you see objects. So we start out with appearances, and the imagined nature is where we reify those appearances. Do I have an appearance of a red apple? You bet. That's what my visual field faculty delivers to me. Is the red apple something that I've simply detected as an object? No. So it's the subject-object duality and the reification as a consequence of the appearance that screws me up. And then he says, the consummate nature can be seen like the unerring objective reference, the objective reference of the eyes when you are free of that clouded vision. So the consummate nature is the elimination of the perception of the clouds in favor of merely the awareness of the appearance. So it's the negation of the superimposition of reality. And now there's a really fun analogy that comes, it's a very popular one in Yogācāra. This is the one of the clear crystal. And I think this is actually a really lovely metaphor.
Professor,
yeah.
could I just quickly ask a question about the consummate nature?
Yeah.
Yeah, is the consummate nature also an appearance?
The consummate nature here is defined as the absence of an appearance. And I think that that's done in a really careful way, because the dependent nature is the appearance. The imagined nature is the superimposition of actuality on that appearance. And the consummate nature is the removal of that superimposition of actuality in the appearance. So it's the appearance without the superimposition of actuality, merely the awareness of the causal process, not the presumption that what's delivered to us has any specific reality apart from that causal process. Now, that's not to say that apples don't exist, but it is to say that when I perceive an apple as being a particular way, the way I perceive it is the output of my sensory faculties, not the apple.
I understand. Okay, thank you very much.
Yep. Okay. Now we get the example of the clear crystal. So you can imagine this as, you know, a cheating jeweler, right? So the cheating jeweler says, "Let me sell you a gorgeous sapphire," and puts a clear glass crystal on a deep blue cloth, and you say, "Wow, what a gorgeous sapphire that is. I think I'll buy it." Sentient beings, when they mistake that clear jewel for a sapphire or a lapis or something, then they're fooled. Well, why are they fooled? Well, you know, the same clear gem, he says, if I put it on a red cloth, it's going to look like a ruby. If I put it on a green cloth, it's going to look like an emerald. A gold cloth, it's going to look like gold, and so forth, right? So what's the point there? The analogy is that we want to see the other dependent nature as like the clear crystal. It doesn't have a color or an appearance of its own. But when it comes into contact, when the dependent nature comes into contact with our sense faculties, like the blue cloth or the red cloth or the green cloth that the jeweler uses, then appearances arise. And we confuse those appearances with the nature of the thing itself. And so the other dependent nature is just like the crystal. And then when we see the consummate nature is the absence of the colors that we saw in the clear crystal. Again, the consummate nature is the absence. The imagined nature is the presence of those colors. It's when we say, "Oh, that's a beautiful emerald. Oh, now it's a beautiful sapphire. Oh, now it's a beautiful ruby." In each of those cases, something else has caused it to appear in a particular way, just as our sense faculties cause things to appear in a particular way. The consummate nature is the absence of that appearance in the thing. So, and he does this in a very nice way by talking about whether it is permanent or impermanent. And this is all happening on 87. So when he says, in the same way, you should see that since the dependent nature is not the consummate nature, it's not permanent, everlasting, and so forth. His point is this: the clarity of the crystal is an adventitious phenomenon. It might be clear, it might be cloudy. There's nothing necessarily permanent about it. But the absence of the blue, that's permanent. That clear crystal was never blue. It was never green. It was never red. And the consummate nature is the final nature of things. The dependent nature is a causal process, but every causal process is completely and eternally devoid of the characteristics that it produces in our consciousness. Those characteristics are up here, the causal process, they're not out there in the causal process. And so he says, when bodhisattvas know the imagined nature as it really is in respect to the dependent nature, then they know characterless phenomena as they really are. So to know the consummate nature is to understand the relationship between the imagined nature and the dependent nature. And so to see the dependent nature without imagining, without that imagined superimposition. And so that's what he says at the next page, when they know the consummate nature as it really is, then
Here,
they
for
know
instance,
phenomena
are
as they
snippets
really
of an
are. Sorry? Question?
No, I think somebody accidentally unmuted.
But was that an actual question for me? No.
Sounds like a computer voice.
Okay, then I won't worry. Now, I want to pause here because we're about to go to a slightly different, different moment in the text, and to ask if there are questions. Yes.
Professor, I just had a quick comment. You know, I was in a class with you many years ago on the same topic at Shore Abbey, and I shared the same thing because I think it's so relevant when you actually state it. Doesn't this take you back to the Bahya Sutta in the Pali Canon, when the Buddha says, when in the scene there is just the scene, and in the herd there is just the herd, that then is the end of suffering?
Exactly. Exactly. We've not left the Pali Canon behind. We're just articulating it in a different way. Yep. So when I said at the very beginning last time that Rangton teaches that the three turnings of the wheel are completely consistent with one another, that the Pali Canon, the first turning, gives us a complete and general description of the nature of samsara and nirvana, that the second turning, the Madhyamaka tradition, teaches us the emptiness of phenomena, emptiness from the side of phenomena, from the side of objects. And the third turning teaches us emptiness from the side of the subject. None of this is about who's right and who's wrong. It's about a constant building and layering of different ways of putting things. It's not, there's no critique here. Yep.
Yeah, there are two more questions, Professor. Alex,
Yes.
would you like to unmute?
Yes. When you talk about our perception of an apple, for example, and we imagine nature is sort of generated from our own side, we perceive the color red.
Yep.
It's because we all perceive the same color. With the there's some characteristic in the phenomenon of the object of perception that we agree something makes us imagine the color, generate the color red in our minds. Would that be part of the dependent nature?
Well, let's think about that for a minute, and let's think about it in connection to several different things, because it's a really, really good question. The first place I want to go with that is the scope of the we, when you say we all see it the same way. If it's just human beings in the room, that's okay. But if we add a dog or two, and maybe some bees, and maybe some birds, then suddenly we're seeing very different ways. Because bees and birds see in the infrared and the ultraviolet, and dogs don't see red very well at all. They kind of graze out for them near as we can tell. So we see red, the dog sees gray, the bees and birds see wild technicolor things going on. And then Yogācāra asks the Buddha, so who is seeing it correctly, Bhagavan? Are the birds seeing the color correctly? Or is the dog seeing the color correctly? Or am I seeing the color correctly? What's the Buddha going to answer at that point? He's going to have to answer that the bees see the apple as it appears to bees, and they do so correctly. That the dog sees the apple as it appears to dogs, and it does so correctly. And you see the apple as it appears to human beings, and you do so correctly. But there is no way that the apple just looks if we abstract from particular kinds of subjects. So we can't say that one of us gets it right and sees the apple characteristic. and the other ones get it wrong. And the superimposition that we're looking at when we talk about this kind of natural attitude or this instinctive reflex is seeing the apple and understanding and thinking of it as, wow, that's what the apple looks like. And I, as a subject, am just faithfully recording reality as it is. Whereas once we begin to think about different possible perceivers, we realize that all I'm doing is perceiving the apple as it manifests through sensory apparatus like mine. So the error isn't in thinking that the apple's red. The error is in thinking that the red apple that I see is me detecting something that was red independent of how I saw it. Now, that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is, yes, this is about the dependent nature. So the fact that you and I both see the apple as red does reflect something important about the dependent nature. And that is that what's going on is a causal process that is very similar in the way that my visual faculty engages the apple and the way your visual faculty engages the apple, but different from the way that a dog's visual faculty engages the apple or a bird's or a bee's visual faculty engages the apple. So both that similarity and those differences are explained by the fact that the dependent nature that we're looking at are either very similar to one another or very different from one another. But in none of those is there redness or technicolorness or grayness, just the potential to produce red experiences or gray experiences or technicolor experiences. And that's where the slippage is. A third way to put that, I'm sorry I'm giving you such a long answer to what sounded like such an easy question, but it's actually a very deep question, so it's going to get a long answer. The third is that it connects to the idea of the Alaya Vijnana, or of the fundamental unconscious cognitive processes that run through us. And so if we think of those fundamental unconscious cognitive processes as our kind of biological inheritance, our genetic inheritance that kind of conditions the way that we see the world, we can see that what explains the fact that the dog sees it one way, the bird sees it another way, and we see it another way, is that we each have different predispositions to experience in virtue of the kind of long evolutionary past that we experience that gives us the kinds of perceptual processes that yield the kinds of experiences that we have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that I guess the question was, is it correct to say that these objects of perception do have specific characteristics and they can be identified correctly by, as you say, like a group of beings? And then
so I think the correct thing might be to say is that the experiences that we have present particular characteristics, but they present them as though those characteristics are in independent objects that have those characteristics, whether or not we experience them. So like right now, for instance, there's a bunch of apples on my kitchen counter downstairs. I know that. And I know that if I look at them, they're going to appear red. Now, if I ask the question, are they red right now, where nobody is down there? What kind of question am I asking? I'm asking the question, are they producing a red experience when nobody's there? No, they're not. Suppose that the only being looking at them is a bee. Then right now, those apples are being experienced as, maybe purple or yellow or technicolor or something, right? But to say what the color of the apple is, independent of the sensory organ that's apprehending it, that turns out to be nonsense. And that's one way of looking at interdependence, one way of looking at what dependent origination looks like. And it's also a way of looking at what the illusion of independence or the illusion of intrinsic identity looks like. The illusion is that the qualities that we observe in things are just in those things, and we are fabulous quality detectors. The reality is that the qualities that we observe emerge in interaction between us and the things with which we engage. So the redness is emerging in the process of perceiving the apple. It's not something that's there independently that we simply detect, even though that seems overwhelmingly plausible.
And so you come back to that point again and again.
I do, because it's a really hard point to convince ourselves of, but it's, I think, the really profound point that Yogācārans are making when they're discussing the phenomenology of perception.
Thank you.
There's one more question, Professor, from Larry.
Yeah, go for it, Larry.
I was wondering, what is the perception of illusion as illusion?
Yeah, that's kind of where we want to go. And we're going to get there on the fourth night when we read Vasubandhu's Trisvabhāvanirdeśa. And he's going to be using a really fun analogy, and that's the analogy of the magic show, and talking about the difference between how a magician perceives the illusions that they're creating versus how the audience perceives those illusions. And it's the difference between seeing something as an illusion and being fooled by that illusion. But let me give you a different analogy just for now, just to give you something to ponder. And it's one that I like to use, especially when I'm talking about Madhyamaka, but it works for Yogācāra too. I want you to imagine three people in a car driving down a desert highway. There's Alice and Bob and Carol. And Alice is a really experienced desert driver. And Bob is wearing polarized sunglasses. And Carol's never been in the desert before. And Carol says to Alice, "Watch out, there's a big puddle of water in the road up ahead." And Alice says, "No, that's just a mirage." And Bob says, "What are you two talking about anyway?" Alice sees the mirage as a mirage. She sees it as an illusion that could deceive somebody else. Carol is sucked in by the mirage, sucked in by the illusion, and sees the mirage as the illusory water. Bob doesn't see anything at all because he's wearing polarized sunglasses. So a really interesting question is, what does omniscience look like? What does awakening look like? Who's seeing things correctly? We might all agree that Carol is wrong. There isn't water on the road. But is the right thing to do not to see the mirage at all, like Bob with his polarized sunglasses? Or is the right thing to do to see the mirage, as Alice does? That's a really interesting question. And I'm going to leave you with that puzzle for a little while. Now, there's one last piece of this chapter that I want to pay attention to, and then I'm going to let everybody go and get ready for the great debate. And that is this nice remark that the Buddha makes shortly after this. He says, Gunakara, when bodhisattvas know the imagined nature as it really is, in relation to the dependent nature, then they know characterless phenomena as they really are. So to know the imagined nature as it is, notice that that's not to fail to see the imagined nature. It's to see it and say, aha, appearances, rather than aha, red apple. Then they know that things are characterless, but our experience has characteristics. When the bodhisattvas know the dependent nature as it really is, they know the phenomena's imagined character as it really is. So to know the dependent nature is to know what kind of appearance it's going to produce. And so to know the dependent nature isn't to fail to see the imagined nature. It's to see the imagined nature as the output of the dependent nature. And Gunācara, when bodhisattvas know the consummate nature as it really is, then they know phenomena's purified character as they really are. That's when you really know things as they are, when you're able to empty the dependent nature of the imagined. And that's the trick in practice. That's where we wanted to go today. And I want to close by asking if there are any other questions, because if there are, now's a really good time to ask. But otherwise, I'm going to let you get ready for watch parties.
I had a question, Professor. Oh, Richard,
Yeah.
you go ahead. Richard, you go ahead.
Now you go, Sneha, you were first.
You guys say,
Thank you. You know, when you talk about the dependent nature and then the consummate nature, like in my mind, they seem the same. Like in the consummate nature, you are seeing the dependent nature as it is.
Okay, you are right and you're wrong. And I want to explain the way in which you're right and the way in which you're wrong, because they're very closely tied. It's a really, really good question. To do that, I want to talk about two different models of the three natures. And we're going to see both of those models articulated as we work through the Trisvabhāvanirdeśa. One model is usually called the progressive model, and the other model is called the pivot model. And I want to start with the progressive model. The progressive model says that you begin by experiencing the imagined nature and not experiencing the dependent nature or the consummate nature at all. That's where we all begin, with the imagined nature. That's what the world we live in. And after a little bit of reflection and reading the Saṃdhinirmocana-sūtra 122 times, we start to say, whoa, this imagined nature that I'm living in, it's an imagined nature. I'm making this world of experience. I'm not just encountering it. That's just amazing, right? And then once you understand that fact, stage 2 is to understand the dependent nature. You say, okay, what's really going on is just a lot of psychophysical causal processes that I am mistaking for a real world. So the dependent nature comes next. And I say, that's what's really there. There's psychophysical processes and experiences and nothing else. But there's a third stage. The third stage is, oh, and what's more, the imagined nature doesn't even appear in those psychophysical processes. It's not there at all. What I was seeing was a superimposition. That is the consummate nature. Now so there you can start to see the distance between them. They're not two different things, but one of them is a nominal. The other one is an accomplishment. It's a past participle. I've now realized the emptiness of the dependent of the imagined. The other way to look at that is a pivot. And that's to say the real McCoy here is the dependent nature. It's dependent origination. It's the causal stream. One way to see it is the imagined way, the parakalpita way. The other way to see it is the consummate way. But now you notice, again, the past participle point that I made at the very beginning comes up. The parakalpita and the paranishpana, the imagined and the consummate, are ways of seeing the dependent. They're not like the dependent. They're not the object that's seen. Like that clear crystal. We could either see it as blue, now it's green, now it's red, or we could see it doesn't have any color at all. That jeweler was tricking me.
So would it be fair to say that the cognitive obscurations, when we talk about that thing, is similar to the idea of the consummate, thinking about the consummate nature?
No, the obscurations are like thinking about the imagined nature. The absence of the obscurations is the consummate nature.
But okay, so maybe I'm asking the wrong thing, but you know how in Madhyamaka they talk about where you get rid of the afflictive obscurations, but appearances still appear to you?
Yep. Yeah,
but you know that the appearance is not intrinsically real, and
exactly.
you're not fooled by it. Is that like
Yeah.
pointing to the
So
consummate
when
nature?
when we're seeing that, then what we're saying is, oh, that imagined nature, it's just an imagined nature. And that's why the Buddha says to Yogācāra, when bodhisattvas really understand the relation between the imagined nature and the dependent nature, that's when they see the consummate nature.
Thank you.
Consummate nature is the actual relation of the imagined to the dependent, namely the imagined ain't there.
Okay.
For those of you who have lived dissolute lives, there's another way that I sometimes explain these three natures. And that's when I say that Yogācāra is basically a drug abuse theory of reality. So you can imagine it this way. Think of samsara as having dropped really bad acid from beginningless time. And so you've got all of this appearances of suffering all around you, right? So it's really bad acid, and you think that you're having this, you know, in this world of complete hell. And then the paramedics come along, and the first thing they tell you is, don't worry, you're just hallucinating. It's all in your head. That is, they're telling you that this is just the imagined nature, but you're still seeing the imagined nature. Then they give you the drug, right? The antidote, the thorazine. And so they give you the thorazine, and then you start coming down and you say, oh, I see, those appearances weren't real. They were just the effects of the acid on my brain. Now you've seen the dependent nature. And then finally it's all over, and you're leaving the emergency room, and there aren't any hallucinations, and you say, oh my God, I just realized that all of that stuff that happened to my brain as a result of that bad acid from beginningless time, that didn't contain anything horrible. I didn't need to be afraid of that stuff. That was just imagined. That's the consummate nature.
Got it. Thank you. Richard?
Now, I'm going to be really deeply suspicious of anybody for whom that analogy was better than the ones in the Saṃdhinirmocana-sūtra.
Well, I won't talk about my flashbacks then. I think that the question I have has to deal with the limitations of analogies.
Yeah.
But if you think of, I'm seeing a red apple, and Debee is seeing a technicolor apple,
Yeah.
and a dog is seeing a gray apple, there is something somewhere that is creating the causal chain that leads up to those perceptions.
Absolutely. That's the dependent nature. Good.
Okay, but is it just the dependent nature? Behind the dependent nature, there is something that at least, I'm not saying that I believe this, I'm saying that it suggests that there is something external to the dependent nature causing this, unless it's turtles all the way down.
No, only because, remember the definition of the dependent nature. It's dependent origination. It's just all the causally interrelated stuff that's happening. It's
Right.
just that when you pay attention to that stuff and you say, okay, so there's got to be something that's causing us all to see an apple there. Right, nobody's disputing that. That's why I say this isn't idealism. But now the question is, but what does it look like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like? And the answer to that is the surprising answer, nothing at all. Because the taste or the feel or the smell only emerge in interaction with a sensory system. That's where the illusion is. The illusion is thinking that there's an apple when there's no apple. That would be a very different kind of illusion.
Yeah, I understand that.
The illusion is thinking that somehow we're detecting characteristics rather than bringing them into being.
Right. Yeah, no, I understand that, but it suggests to me that there's some sort of intrinsic existence at the center of the dependent nature. And that's the concern that I have.
Got it. And that's Chandrakirti's concern too, right? Because Chandrakirti in Madhyamaka argues that the trouble with Yogācāra is that it takes the dependent nature to truly exist. And that's why he thinks that. I think that that's an unfair reading, actually.
Yeah.
And the reason I think that it's an unfair reading is it's not saying that any of these things truly exist. It's saying that they are interdependent phenomena that don't have the characteristics that we impute to them. It's not denying that they're causally arisen. It's not denying that they depend on their parts. It's not denying that they depend on conceptual imputation for their individuation or anything. It's just saying that what we do, the illusion that we perform in our ordinary phenomenology, is that we take the characteristics that arise in our consciousness and we slather them all over those objects and think that somehow we've detected them. By the way, there's a really neat analogy here for those of you who care about theoretical physics to the relational interpretation of quantum mechanics. So if you look at relational quantum mechanics, read books by Carlo Rovelli on this, for instance, you'll see exactly the same point being made. It's not that properties don't exist. It's that they don't exist in objects independent of being detected. That properties arise in the context of detection.
Right.
Yeah. The illusion is they were there all along and I just detected them.
Thanks. I have to think about this some more, but thanks.
This is all worth thinking about a lot more.
Yeah.
Abelardo, you had a question?
Yes, yes, thank you. Yeah, I want to continue with that line of thinking that you're sharing now. My fundamental question is, how is the consummate nature established in actual social discourse, let's say, for people who follow Yogācāra? It seems to me similar challenge to what one finds in contemporary philosophy of science in the West. The early 20th century, the physicalist approach was dominating, and where there was a reality in itself, and that we could ultimately, with our instruments, tune in to what the sensory processes actually show, and then that reached a whole set of questions, and you had other epistemological approaches emerging, like Popper's conventionalist approach. That ultimately it's about conventions, and we don't actually are able, individuals and collectively, to perceive the things in themselves, the phenomena in themselves. So how in this context would these kinds of criteria apply?
I would toss Paul Feyerabend into the mix, who reminded us that our sensory organs are measuring instruments, just like telescopes and light meters are measuring instruments. And that, as he put it, if you look through a tube and you see some light, you'd better first figure out whether it's a telescope or a kaleidoscope before you consider that to be data, right? And then he asked the question, so now you're looking through your eyes and hearing through your ears and thinking through your brain. What evidence do you have that that's a telescope and not a kaleidoscope? That's the idea that Yogācāra is messing with here, right? The idea that what we're doing is presuming ourselves to be telescopes, when in fact we actually know that we're more like kaleidoscopes.
So does that imply that they do seek to reach some kind of consensus of what's actually there in a social context?
Well, we can come to very good consensus about the imagined nature, right? We can agree that red delicious apples are red and that Granny Smiths are green. We can all agree that the sky is blue and the grass is green and snow is white. We're really good at that. That's why we can call that conventional truth. But what the Yogācārans are pointing out is that when we say that that's conventional truth, we're also forgetting that it's completely constructed, that it's completely imagined, that we really are functioning kaleidoscopically, not telescopically. There aren't pre-existing things that we're just detecting. We're just each using the same kind of apparatus to construct the world that we inhabit.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Convergence doesn't mean independent reality.
Sure. So it is some form of conventionalism, maybe, huh?
Sure,
Sounds like it.
sure, it's Buddhism.
Great, thank you.
Anytime.
Last question, Samansh.
Professor, yes, I was just thinking a little bit about comparing Yogācāra and trying to restate the consummate nature. So I mean, when studying Madhyamaka, right, and we are studying people who precede the path of seeing, then at some point in time they get to the path of seeing. Our teachers say that on the path of seeing, in meditation, right, what the person sees on the path of seeing sees the emptiness of the phenomena.
That's right.
Okay, so I mean, if you then, I mean, therefore I would equate that to say that the person on the path of seeing in meditational equipoise is seeing the consummate nature.
I want you to hold that thought till next week, because what we're talking about today are the positive nature of things. But the question Paramartha Samagata is going to ask is, hey, Buddha, when you said everything was empty, what did you mean? So Gunakara says, you said things have characteristics, what did you mean? And then Paramartha Samagata is going to say, whoa, but you also said they were empty. What does that mean? And then we're going to get the Yogācāra analysis of emptiness. And that's going to come next week.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm not dodging your question. I'm saying that's the topic of next week. And with that, I'm going to say good night.
Thank you very
Spend
much.
the next 30 minutes propitiating every deity you can.
Thank you very much, Professor. See you next week. Thank
Indeed.
you, everyone.
Thank
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good luck to us
Good
all.
night.